But good old Hercules would botch the job again, and wind up leaving Carausius' position even stronger than it had been before. The upshot of the botched retaking of Britain was Diocletian's realization that 2 emperors were perhaps not enough. The British question wasn't going anywhere, but the empire couldn't afford to have Maximian forever bogged down on the Gallic coast. He was needed elsewhere. So next week, we will see another doubling of imperial authority, and for the first time in its long history, Rome would have 4 emperors working in concert with each other, a system that we have come to know as the Tetrarchy. Before we go this week, I want to mention 2 things for those of you out there who just can't get enough Mike Duncan in your lives. First, I did an interview last week with Andrew Johnston on his podcast Squared Show. So if you want to listen to me ramble on about various topics and say and sort of a lot, you can download Podcast Squared on iTunes or at the Lifestyle Pod Network. The URL for the direct download is a mouthful, so I'll just post a link at thehistoryofrome.typepad.com. Second, in the more funsy category, I will be a guest on listener Matthew Johnson's local Austin radio show Remix on Wednesday, January 19th at 2 p.m. Central Time. What I get to do is bring in a mixtape of music and then talk with him about the relationship between work and writing and music, so it should be lots of fun. If you want to listen to the music that I listen to while writing the show, you can stream Co-op Radio online at www.koop.org. That too will get a link at thehistoryofrome.typepad.com. So January 19 at 2 p.m. See you then. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 80,000 titles to choose from. And when you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book. Or you can keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all your future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to pass along a recommendation from the paterfamilias of the history of Rome, Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand, the amazing, gut-wrenching story of the man who should have broken the 4-minute mile, but instead, well, let's just say there's a reason why it's a whole book, and a reason why it's been on Audible's top 10 list forever. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 123, The Tetrarchy. I want to begin this week with a correction regarding the legend of Diocletian's ascension. As many of you have noted, the doomed Praetorian prefect Lucius Aper's name does not translate into English as ass at all, but instead as boar. And it's a good thing that it does, because when I went back and checked the supposed prophecy issued to young Diocletian, it actually says that he would gain the throne after killing a boar. So the pun still works, I just wrote down the wrong animal name when I was working up the outline for that week's show. I feel doubly silly for making this mistake, since way back during the episodes on the First Punic War, I told you all the story of how Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio managed to earn the cognomen Asina after leading the Romans into their first naval battle, and consequently, first naval defeat in 261 BC. Scipio the Ass, they called him. Why I thought that Aper should now also translate as ass is a mystery for the ages. I regret the error, and thanks to all of you out there who corrected the mistranslation, with an official hat tip to listener LB for being first on the scene. Last week, we covered the first few years of Diocletian's reign, and specifically, his decision to elevate his colleague Maximian to the rank of Caesar in 285, and then to co-Augustus in 286. This week, we will see the Imperial College expand even further, as two more generals, Constantius and Galerius, will be invited to share in the purple in 293. This division of sovereignty at first proved to be an inspired move, and helped to ensure that Rome remained ascendant from Britain to Mesopotamia and everywhere in between. But eventually, the system will collapse when it comes time to hand off the so-called Tetrarchy to the next generation. But though it would not survive, the years of the Tetrarchy are amongst the most important in Roman history, and not just because they set the stage for the rise of Constantine the Great. Under the watchful eye of Diocletian and his colleagues, the Roman world will be transformed in ways both large and small to better meet the challenges that it now faced. All of which poses a bit of a problem for your humble podcaster. You see, this fragmentation of imperial authority leads to a fragmentation of the narrative, as now 4 separate centers of power are running 4 separate political and military apparatuses simultaneously. And when you couple this with the fact that along the way life as everyone knew it was being radically redefined, what you get is a big old mess. Say what you want about the drawbacks of Aurelian running around like a crazy person doing everything by himself, but at least it made for a coherent storyline. The 290s and early 300s AD, on the other hand, are a confused mess of war, politics, economic reform, and social reconstruction all happening all at once. So what I've decided to do is to try to run the chronological narrative up to the beginning of the Great Persecution of 303 AD, which will take maybe 2 full episodes. And then we'll double back and cover the reforms Diocletian made to the military structure, the governmental apparatus, and the economic system, all of which may require separate episodes unto themselves, though I haven't yet decided how exactly I'm going to break it down. We are in the process of establishing the ground rules for late antiquity, so I don't want to gloss over anything, but I also don't want to get so bogged down that we don't make any forward progress at all. Okay, are we ready? Here we go. In the spring of 288, Diocletian arrived in Gaul to meet with his brother Emperor Maximian and help lay the foundation for the eventual retaking of Britain and the Gallic coast from the usurper Carausius. Without a fleet of their own, the 2 Augusti, for the moment, had to focus on pacifying the mainland so that when the inevitable invasion of Britain was launched, they would not have to worry about trouble from the Germanic tribes at their rear. For the rest of the year, they ran joint campaigns on the far side of the Rhine, with Maximian operating on the lower half of the river and Diocletian covering the upper half. It was a merciless scorched earth war that saw crops and livestock as much the target of legionary aggression as the tribesmen themselves, and by the end of the year, the exhausted and starved Germans were in no position to threaten Roman interests. Fortune was finally smiling on the Romans again, and the 2 Augusti even began the process of reoccupying portions of the Limes Germanicus that had been more or less abandoned some 20 years before. Satisfied with the hammer he had just laid on the Germans, Diocletian withdrew back to the east at the end of the year to keep an eye on the rest of the empire, while his colleague was busy with the British question. And in the spring of 289, Maximian was ready to answer that question. An invasion fleet had been under construction for some time, and now that the Germans were fairly well pacified, Maximian was able to use the Rhine Delta as his launching pad into the North Sea. Though the emperor had no choice but to attempt to retake Britain, from the very beginning he faced an uphill battle. Carausius and his navy were experts at navigating the rough northern waters, and their experience stood in stark contrast to Maximian and his utterly green navy. On top of that, Carausius had been hard at work fortifying the British coast, and in particular, beefing up the so-called Forts of the Saxon Shore, a series of 9 fortresses, which though built at different periods, were very likely fused by Carausius into a single unit of command at this point in history. What this all meant is that even if Maximian ran Carausius' blockade, he would find no easy landing sites on the other side. But still, Maximian had to try, and so try he did. It is perhaps not surprising that all we know today about the invasion of 289 is that it failed. Emperors were not in the habit of dwelling on their defeats, so it is only by way of a few passing references that we even know the attempt was made at all, and these diplomatically blame the weather for Maximian's failure to retake Britain. And who knows, maybe it was the weather. It's not like the North Sea and the English Channel are the calmest bodies of water in the world, but it's just as likely that Maximian's inexperience on the seas made him easy pickings for Carausius' expert fleet, and that it was man and not nature who drove the emperor back. Whoever it was, Maximian's fleet was destroyed, and Hercules was now further from recapturing Britain than he had ever been. As fast as the imperial post allowed, news reached Diocletian, who by that time had planted himself in Persia, and the no doubt severely disappointed emperor spent 290 AD making his way back to the west, very possibly forming in his mind the new order he would soon introduce to the world along the way. Beaten and battered, Maximian at this point seems to have taken at least some note of what could now only be described as his shaky political position. Whatever the long-term consequences of Diocletian's new argument of rule by divine right, at that time, at that moment, legitimacy was still based on one thing and one thing only: military victory. Perhaps sensing that his subordinate commanders were salivating, Maximian secured the loyalty of the best and most ambitious of them all by arranging for the man to divorce his wife and marry Maximian's daughter Theodora, thus securing a familial alliance that Maximian hoped would help keep him propped up in power while he, or more accurately Diocletian, figured out what to do next. The man in question was a fellow Illyrian general with a naturally pale complexion by the name of Constantius Chlorus. Constantius had been born around 250 AD in Illyria, so he was just about the same age as the man who was about to become his, quote, father. Though there is a whole tradition that has Constantius being the son of nobility, it is more likely that, like the rest of the Illyrian emperors, he was of low birth, and that his son Constantine went back and gave his father a more prestigious pedigree to bolster his own imperial claims, specifically linking the family to the Emperor Claudius Gothicus by way of Constantius's mother Claudia. Whatever his genealogical heritage, Constantius proved his worth as a soldier right away, and while still in his early 20s, he was promoted into the ranks of Aurelian's elite bodyguard. Right around this time, he also sired a child with his wife Helena, a son who would become known as Flavius Valerius Aurelius Constantius, but who we know today as Constantine. Constantius, meanwhile, fought alongside Aurelian during the Palmyrene Wars, and then continued his climb up the ranks during the reigns of Probus and Carus, eventually finding himself governor of Dalmatia when the confrontation between Carinus and Diocletian exploded into open war, which meant that he was quite literally caught in the middle when the fighting began. But displaying some nimble prescience, Constantius declared for Diocletian right before the issue was decided, and it should be remembered, right before it was at all clear that Diocletian was going to win. And so he wound up squarely, but just barely, in the victory.